Everyone, welcome to PCL READS Leslie Kern. I'm Lee, a librarian from Mount Pleasant Library, and I'm here with Amy, the manager at Mount Washington Park Library. Each month we've been traveling to one of the 9 Providence Community Library locations where they've co-hosted the event, chosen our next meeting, reading selection, and sometimes invited the author to visit. So this year, we've already been to Orneyville, South Providence, and Wanskuck libraries. But for tonight's event, we invited Groundwork Rhode Island's director, Amelia Rose, to co-host. Groundwork Rhode Island is a local nonprofit organization dedicated to creating healthier and more resilient urban communities. You may be familiar with one of their countless programs like Green Team Youth Employment, Harvest Cycle Composting Service, the Prairie Avenue Greenhouse, not to mention the soon-to-be West End Compost Hub. The list really just goes on and on. So I'm thankful that Amelia agreed to take the reins of PCL Reads tonight, and I really couldn't be happier with the results. So Amelia, you have the floor.
Great, thank you. And thanks so much to Lee and to Amy for inviting Groundwork Rhode Island to be part of PCL Reads. I'm really excited about tonight's author talk, and I'm so glad Dr. Kern is here with us in person, virtually, and also to see so many folks participating. And when Lee first asked me to help select a book for PCL Reads, I really wanted to think about a book that encapsulates the mission of Groundwork Rhode Island, but quickly realized that is impossible and no single book can do that. But I knew that whatever book we chose would say something about our organization. So I ended up looking for books focused on urban planning. Sometimes Groundwork Rhode Island is known as an environmental organization, which it definitely is. But beyond that, we're really all about making cities better for the people who live there through environmental improvement, as well as creating economic opportunities. And so luckily I found a list of the best urban planning books of 2019. And there on the list was Feminist City. And for me, what really interested me in this book and what I've been enjoying while reading it in preparation for tonight are the personal stories and real world examples that Dr. Kern shares that make the policy decisions that we associate with urban planning really come to life. And the gender equity lens that she helps us see through, and importantly, not by itself, but also in combination with seeing through the lens of racial and economic equity as well, I found really interesting and compelling, and have just been learning a lot already and thinking about ways to apply it to our work. So thank you all for being here, and I'm excited about the conversation and hope folks have been able to read at least part of the book and have some questions prepared. So I get to introduce Dr. Leslie Kern. She is an associate professor of geography and environment and director of women's and gender studies at Mount Allison University in New Brunswick, Canada. That's in Canada. She is the author of the book that is the focus of tonight, Feminist City, Claiming Space in a Man-Made World, as well as Sex and the Revitalized City, Gender, Condominium Development, and Urban Citizenship. And her research focuses on gentrification in North American cities, exploring issues such as embodiment, gendered labor conditions, and environmental and human health using feminist urban theory. So thank you, Dr. Kern, for being with us, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Amelia, and thank you to Lee and Amy and the Providence Community Library for inviting me here tonight. Thank you to all of you for being here with me. I'd like to acknowledge that tonight I'm visiting you from the traditional and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq and Maliseet people, on whose lands we are governed by ongoing treaties of peace and friendship. My pronouns are she, her, and if you want to follow me on Twitter, my social media is @LelyK, which I can put in the chat a little bit later. So I thought I would start out with kind of starting from the personal, as Amelia noted is a theme in the book, and then try to share some principles and ideas and values that I think are kind of central to the feminist city, and then kind of segue a little bit into a conversation with Amelia and with all of you. So I grew up in Mississauga, which is a huge suburb of Toronto, and I moved to downtown to the city to go to the University of Toronto for my undergraduate education. As a young woman, I loved being in the city. I felt free and independent and confident on the not really all that mean streets of downtown Toronto. I felt very urban, very at home most of the time. Underneath all of that fun and freedom was this other consciousness, the voice of years of socialization telling me to be afraid. Sometimes the voices of men who whistled or hurled vulgar insults when I didn't respond. And these voices told me that I was supposed to behave in certain ways, to avoid certain spaces, and to make special and sometimes complicated plans to stay safe. One example of those is that in my first year of university, my three closest friends, my roommate and the woman who lived in the dorm room next door to us, we had this system, which was pretty annoying at the time, but uh, also felt sort of essential. I do also describe this in the book. If one of the three of us was coming home alone on the subway, we would call the others when we got off at the nearest station. And of course, this was from a payphone because we didn't have cell phones in the mid 1990s at university. So to have your quarter, call your friends, hope somebody actually answers their landline. And then the other two would walk the 10 minutes up the street to collect me, or whichever one of us was there alone at the subway, so that the three of us would walk back down to our residence. It was kind of like no woman left behind kind of scenario that, now that I look back upon this from, the hindsight of 25 years, it's both a little bit endearing and also kind of exasperating, because of course, none of the men that we knew who lived in the same place and were the same age as us, none of them felt that they had to take these kind of over the top precautions just to move in very simple ways through their city. So I was well aware that that was a sexist double standard and that we were kind of trapped in this sexist bind even before we had the more commonplace now language of rape culture to describe this kind of overwhelming sense of the way in which women are positioned as always vulnerable to attack and so on. But aside from that, the city was largely accessible to me. I felt connected. I loved hopping on a streetcar. I loved striding confidently along the crowded sidewalks. All of that changed, however, when I became a mom. Suddenly, the city, in this case, London, where I was living when I had my daughter, the city was out to get me, or so it seemed, from the inaccessible buses to angry pedestrians, kind of elbowing my stroller out of the way, to the sort of dirty looks that you get when you're in a public space and you're trying to nurse a baby or calm them down or change them. I'm sure maybe some of you in the audience tonight have had these experiences. And I found that the city was now giving me a very different message, like, you don't belong here anymore. So of course, my sort of previous feelings of mobility and freedom were predicated on privileges such as whiteness and able-bodiedness, but it hadn't occurred to me that all of the sites of oppression and discrimination that my women's studies degree had taught me to identify were also built right into the spaces around me, right into the city itself. I was starting to understand that the built environment, and the city in particular, was part of the wider infrastructure of power relations that feminism had to work to dismantle. I was on my way to becoming a feminist geographer. Now, at that point, when I was a new mom living in the city of London, I had never yet heard of feminist geography. That came a couple of years later when I was back in school doing my master's degree and then my PhD. And one of the most common questions that I get asked when I do talks is, can you explain what a feminist geographer is? It doesn't necessarily seem intuitive to people. I think we maybe remember our middle school geography lessons where you had to kind of color in maps or maybe memorize state capitals or figure out the watershed system of the Great Lakes and all of these kinds of topics. So I think, what on earth does that have to do with feminism or gender or sexism? Well, from a human geography standpoint, which is one that is not only concerned with the physical or the natural environment, but with the human relationship to those environments, we try to understand not only the ways that human beings impact the spaces around us, whether, again, those are natural spaces or the human-made spaces that we create, but also how those spaces can affect us, and not just affect us as individuals, but affect us uh, it, socially, politically, culturally, economically. So essentially, we're trying to understand how power works in different places. So to me, being a feminist geographer is about trying to understand how ideas about gender, like gender norms and gender roles, are uh, part of the fabric of the built environment, how they kind of get expressed through the sorts of places that we build and the environments that we create, but also thinking about how those environments then shape us, right? How they shape gender, how they continue to shape gender relations. So in this kind of feedback cycle, right? Society shapes space, space shapes society. So a feminist geographer's point of view is one that is particularly interested in gender, but not only gender. We're also interested in thinking about how different forms of power relations intersect with one another. So trying to understand how sexism, racism, classism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, all of these systems of power, how they might come together to shape the experiences, life chances, and so on of different groups of people in society. So that's sort of a quick explanation of what I've come to understand feminist geography as, and I've found it to be a very productive home for me as a feminist scholar. It's not obviously the only way to do feminist research, but it, for me, when I sort of discovered that this was a way that we could understand power and sexism, it was like adding that third dimension, right? To see how power was working not just in our interpersonal relationships or through like a legal regime, for example, but literally through the spaces all around us. So to me, that has remained kind of a fascinating subject of inquiry. And I guess it also leads me to maybe share a little bit about why I wrote this book at this particular time, or I guess now a couple of years ago when I actually sat down and wrote it. I was interested in contributing to broader feminist conversations about sexism, about gender relations, about power and inequality in society. And I feel like these have been having a good moment over the last 5 or 10 years when I think about the work of people like Roxane Gay or Rebecca Traister, Rebecca Solnit, Tressie McMillan Cottom, people who are writing both from their own experiences, but also about the broader context that they're in. And I was kind of thinking like, what could I contribute to this conversation? What's my angle? What's my little piece that could also help, expand our understanding of these issues? And so for me, it was like, well, the city, that's what I study. And often, even though people will, space and place are always present in these other sorts of books that I've talked about, they're not necessarily problematized, right? Or really looked into in terms of how the spaces themselves are sort of active participants in whatever it is that's going on. So I thought, oh, that's something that I could write about. This is what I do in my day job, right? I talk about this with my students all the time. I talk about it with my fellow colleagues and my fellow feminist geographers. But I also realize that, for most everyday people sort of moving around your city, you're not necessarily looking around going, oh, this street is so sexist, or, what's with this, patriarchal crosswalk? Like, this is not probably the way that you're thinking about space on a day-to-day basis. So it seemed like, okay, this is maybe a moment where I could share some of both my own experience and all of this knowledge, everything that I've been studying for so many years, to encourage people to look around their cities in in a little bit of a different way, to not take the spaces around them for granted, to not assume that these spaces have just always been this way, they always will be this way, or that they've been truly designed with some, lofty principle of sort of perfect efficiency, or whatever we might imagine is the rationale behind space, and to sort of expose the way in which, a lot of different norms, values, ideas, and biases get incorporated into the built environment. So that was sort of my mission from the book, and based on the reception that it has been getting over the past couple of years, I think people have certainly related, both through their own experiences and just what they've started to notice in different ways around the city. Like, I remember my brother, who I talk about a little bit in the book, him saying to me after he wrote it that when he's on the subway, he really notices now how people take up space, how people with young children and strollers are able to access the public transit system, what seems safe or unsafe to different groups of people. And that was really kind of what I was aiming for, that people could look around and see with a slightly different set of eyes. Now, over the past year, obviously, we've been living in I could not have predicted that I would be spending a lot of time talking about the idea of the feminist city during a global pandemic. And it has been really interesting to see the kinds of ideas and principles and questions that people are really picking up on in this time period. And even for myself, things that I look back and think, oh, I didn't really emphasize that in the book in the way that maybe if I was writing it now, I would. So it's been like a new lens kind of to look back on what I wrote. And it has certainly kind of crystallized for me, I think, some of the core values that I would associate with a concept of the feminist city. And I say this very much not as though these ideas just like, came to me and they're my unique ideas, but it's been a process of thinking that has really developed through many conversations, just like this event tonight, that I've been lucky enough to have with people all over the world over the last year, in order to kind of get a deeper understanding of what is really at stake when we talk about the city and when we talk about gendered and other forms of inequalities. So I thought I would just share a few of those principles, those things that have really, as I say, kind of crystallized for me over the last year. So one of those I sort of label the idea of margin to center. And what I mean by this is that when thinking about how urban space is designed and planned and built, that instead of designing or imagining this kind of universal male subject, usually a kind of white, middle-class, able-bodied, cisgender, economically productive man as the majority for whom cities are designed, what if we started from the groups that are seen as at the margins, whether those are women, caregivers, seniors, disabled people, homeless people, recent immigrants, people of color, Indigenous people? What if we started from those groups and recognize that taken together, we are the majority? that sort of almost mythical standard man, he is at best a minority. And in reality, even that figure probably doesn't represent the experience of the majority of men today and how their lives are kind of organized. So I think sometimes there's this concern maybe in design and planning circles that if you were to design, say, for example, with disabled people at the center of your concept of design, that you're designing for a niche, right? You're designing for like a special interest group in society. But in actuality, as I say, when you take all of those so-called niche groups, all of those so-called minority groups and put us together, we are the majority. And this is not to say that that standard man, that he is left out of the picture. In fact, things will be just fine for him, right? He does not suddenly get marginalized in this picture. He doesn't lose his access to spaces because there are more ramps or more space for strollers and children on public transportation. In fact, it's a way of doing things that would imagine lifting the inclusivity of the city up for absolutely everybody. So how can we move those who are seen as at the margins of planning and design into the center of how we conceptualize the city? The second principle that has like really risen to the top of my consciousness and for so many people around the world is the way in which care work has been at best an afterthought in so many cities and urban planning. And by care work, I mean all of that work, both paid and unpaid labor that goes into looking after children, looking after the home, looking after elderly people, caring for sick people, feeding your community, volunteer work, all of this labor that is so undervalued and done disproportionately by women and people of color in, at least in Canada and the US. And during the pandemic, the, you know, absolutely ragged social safety nets that we've been sort of clinging to for dear life have just been completely shredded. And we've noticed, many people seemingly for the first time, that there are profound gender inequalities in terms of this care work crisis. So what does this have to do with cities? Well, we could think about how can we design cities to put care work at the center, or at least not this afterthought that we don't really care about. So how could we reimagine our public spaces as places where some of this care work could be shared and collectivized, so it's not constantly placed on the shoulders of individual women in the invisible private space of the home? What kind of infrastructure could we develop that would support care work? And there are answers to these questions, right? It's not completely pie in the sky. There are ways of organizing transportation systems that would facilitate care work. There are the kinds of spaces that we would incorporate, whether those are accessible spaces like incorporating ramps and elevators, also bathroom or restroom spaces where care work, either of children, of elderly people, disabled people, anyone who needs a bit of extra care, can happen. Spaces where we can, collectively rest and socialize and have shelter and shade and water and food. Spaces where we could collectively feed one another, spaces where children could be outdoors for learning, right? All of these things are options. And we've seen in some cases that the pandemic has opened a little bit of space to push some of those options forward. But I do worry that maybe we are not going to see as great a transformation in that as we could. So for me, care work, I certainly talk about it in the book, but if I was writing it now, during or after the pandemic, I think it would be like a much more central part of what I talk about. Connected to care work are sort of issues of housing as well. And I talk a little bit about housing in the book, but early on, someone pointed out to me, you don't really talk about the home that much. And I thought, that's true. I kind of gloss over the home. But again, the pandemic has maybe sharpened for many of us the limits of what the single family home can be, what it can do, what it can support in terms of family and work and children and caring for sick people, fulfilling all of our social and economic needs. And again, this is a bit of an urban question, like what other forms of housing could we be building? How could we imagine other ways of living with one another that don't, again, kind of privatize care work into the home or isolate people into the single family home, which is we take for granted that this is the normal way that people live, but really, historically speaking, the single family home is a pretty new way of living. And the last principle that I'll mention before we maybe start to move towards discussion is the idea of the importance of designing cities and urban spaces with human bodies in mind. And this might seem like a weird thing to say, but often, and I think maybe many people would intuitively know this, that sometimes when you're moving through an urban space, it doesn't feel like it was planned for people that are like actual organic living human beings, right? People that need to use the restroom, people that need to sit down, people that need water or shade. It sometimes feels as though urban space has been designed for cars, right? We've got lots of space for cars. We've got lots of space for like economic activities or consumption activities. But all of this, any spaces that would really be kind of like human centered and that would address just the basic human needs that we have as organic beings, have often been designed out of cities in part of a fear of homeless people using spaces. So we've decided nobody can sit down anywhere. So what if we started from the principle that people have bodies and we all have bodily needs, and how could our cities better reflect and support those needs? So as I was getting ready for tonight, I was looking online a little bit about the work of the Groundwork organization. And of course, I've only had the chance to learn about it through the website since I can't be physically with you in Providence. But some of the things that I thought were interesting and that for me kind of connected to ideas that I think about in terms of the feminist city was the way in which it's literally a ground up approach, which I think is sort of reflected in the name as well, right? That it's community led and it's, you know, grassroots essentially, like coming from the ground up. And one of the things that I talk about in Feminist City is the way that, you know, we don't have to wait, and we probably shouldn't wait for the city or for the state to offer us opportunities to do things differently. It's probably not going to happen, or it's going to be very slow and very limited and very entrenched in existing systems. So sometimes we have to make our own. We have to create our own spaces and programs and ways of doing things. So when people ask me, oh, where is there a feminist city? I think, well, it doesn't exist really yet as a city, but it exists in the things that people do, right? As communities, as organizations. And I also like the way that Groundwork doesn't put objectives like sustainability and equity and economic growth in competition with each other, which again, I think mainstream systems often do. Like, oh, you can't have jobs if you want a clean environment, or oh, you want to tackle climate change, then why are we talking about social inequalities, as if these things aren't all connected. So I appreciate that. And I was also really intrigued by their work to kind of understand and try to mitigate, or at least respond to, the connections between things like climate change vulnerability and histories of racism and segregation. Because I think a feminist intersectional way of thinking is really about understanding that these things are all interlinked, and that we can't, for example, tackle climate change without tackling social and economic inequalities. So I thought I would just segue with those remarks, because I thought there was some interesting parallels there, but I'm happy to kind of quiet my remarks for a little bit and see what conversation and question arises. So thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Leslie. So we've got a few people popping up with some stuff in the chat. So the way Lee and I have always run PCL Reads is to make this as informal and like we are in person as much as we can. So I will go through the chat and ask people if they would like to unmute and unvideo and say hello to you, Leslie, and ask their question.
Sounds
so
good.
First in the chat, and obviously no one's pressured to do that, so you can opt out and I will read the question if you want to. Gabrielle is asking first. Gabrielle, would you like to unmute or unvideo and say hello to Leslie? Okay, well, I will read her question. So she was asking, why do you think there aren't more men listening to your talk right now?
You've really kind of hit something on the head there, which I think is a longstanding problem, that if you put gender or feminist or sex or sexism in the title of something, then a lot of women will show up and relatively fewer men will. And this is, it's a pernicious sort of problem, because sometimes you think, well, are we sort of preaching to the converted? On the one hand, sometimes I really appreciate having the space to have conversations with sort of predominantly women in the audience, but on the other hand, there's lots of things that men also need to hear. So what is the why there? I think there's still, an assumption that anything that has to do with gender is a woman's issue, that we haven't really understood that gender and gender relations are, well, they're not even just binary, right? That there's a spectrum of gender identities and a spectrum of sort of gendered power relations that happen, that affect everybody, whatever your gender identity happens to be. So if I had the answer to kind of how we would change that, I would sort of bottle it and sell it for $1 million. But thank you for pointing it out.
I'm going to take the next chat question or comment from Judith Maisel. Judith, do you want to unmute yourself and talk about the washrooms, or make a comment?
Yeah, no, I was being semi-sarcastic, but I live here in Chicago, and so it's always a challenge to find a clean women's washroom, no matter where I go. But regarding feminist cities, and I find that when women lead organizations, it's a totally different kind of animal. Not always, but on the whole, women seem to be more inclusive, kinder, thoughtful. It's sort of in our DNA. So as far as creating feminist cities, historically, we were always near the hearth, weren't we? Early on, thousands of millions of years ago, we were always near the hearth. So sometimes it's just so challenging to escape those roles. But my husband, who passed away a while ago, I'd like to think that he was a Renaissance guy, and that we should really start bringing more men into the conversation. Otherwise, things will never change. So I think we're seeing that more and more, not only on the national scene, but within our own relationships as well. So I have seen some webinars on male allyship, and I think that's a good idea, and start to bring men into the conversation. Otherwise, really nothing will change, or it may change, but very slowly. I say to my friends now, and I'll stop after this comment, in relation to the pandemic and some of the other horrific events that we've seen, and I'll attribute it mostly to male leadership. I mean, how are we doing so far with that? So if we haven't realized that this is a time for change and to bring women and our marginalized communities into conversation, then there's no hope.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, when I'm on the days when I wake up and feel optimistic, I do think that this has been a moment where maybe some people for whom these issues of like care work and how we use public space and how we organize our cities to like literally keep ourselves alive, those questions maybe weren't at the front of their mind, but maybe they have become more front of mind in based on everything that we've been living through over the past year, more than a year now. So, in those moments, I think, okay, there's like an opening there, right? And I would say that I've seen that. I think there, even just with my book, there has been great interest in it from architects and planners and people who I didn't necessarily, I thought I was maybe a little bit writing to them, but I didn't know if they would really pay that much attention. I'm not a planner or an architect. What do I know, right? So I think it has been a moment where a wider swath of people are maybe willing to hear conversations that they didn't think had anything to do with them before.
I think too that we need to honor and celebrate the women leaders that we do see. So I'm connected to one of our academic medical centers here, and we have one of our big gala coming up I hope in person at the end of the year. So I'm suggesting that we celebrate our women physicians, who usually, like in every field. So anytime I can recognize women, speak up for women, that starts the conversation oftentimes going in another direction.
It's great. Yeah.
Thank you, Judith. That was wonderful. Next up, we have Gail Gifford. Would you like to unmute and talk about what your comment was?
I will. So so first of all, Leslie, thank you. I took, as an undergraduate in college, geography of American poverty, with Dick Peat, which opened my eyes to the whole field and ended up as a geography major. So it's great to be here with a focus on urban social geography. So, and it's served me well in my career. The systems thinking, really the way to kind of look at the whole world. So my comment was about kids. In one of my lives, I worked at what is now Plan USA or Plan International, and my husband also worked there on the international side. And when the United Nations was doing its Habitat 2 special session, this whole perspective of children in looking at their spaces. And I think there's a sort of a nice link there if you're thinking of all the intersectionality. How do children experience the city? How do they experience their home? What does that look like to them? What's safe? What isn't safe? Where do they go? How do they travel? How do they define their neighborhood? Is intriguing. And which then led me into thinking about, I had a job in an environmental organization where we were talking about reducing vehicles miles traveled. And, back to the Feminist City, it's like, if you've got to take your kids to childcare and then take them, another group to school, and then to get to your job, and then having to do an errand during the day, like how is the city defined? How does public transit work? All of that, the difficulty of that. So I guess the question is sort of how do we begin to shift urban planning and architecture and design to consider all of that more?
Yeah, those are great points. And that mobility question is one that, oh man, literally decades, like literally since the 1970s, research has shown, and all over the world has shown it to be true, that women do make more of those caregiving type trips, that their journeys through the city are not linear, home to work, work to home. They're not 9 to 5. They involve more stops, more journeys to different sorts of areas that are not as well connected by transit. They pay more for transportation. They have more hassles. Like, this is decades and decades of research. And yet our public transportation systems, in part because they are squeezed by austerity as well, are, still focused on this kind of notion of this economic man, this commuter, this breadwinner who goes from the suburbs to the city. And as I said before, I don't even think that reflects like the majority of men's lives in cities, especially men who are not middle class, men who, work in blue collar and service industries. Like, this is not the norm for anybody anymore. So yeah, your question, how do we change this? I mean, I think we have to keep insisting that like, this isn't working for the majority of people, and that it is a justice issue, transit and mobility. And that's just one example. It is a justice issue. And it's going to also be a climate issue and a sustainability issue. So if we can kind of, package our demands in as many like layers of urgency as we can, then maybe we'll start to see some change. And again, maybe the pandemic is kind of a moment where we're realizing that those old systems haven't been serving us all that well.
Thanks, Gail. The next person who made a comment in the chat is Therese Shea. I don't know if you wanted to unmute and make a comment. All right. Well, she said that her son is a feminist, so she's a proud mama. Good for you. That's what we need, is more sons being raised as feminists. Oh, and Amy, are you going to take the next one?
Yeah, I will. Let's see. So Jessica Kilgore, you made a comment tying in with Gail's comment. So if you'd like to jump in, feel free.
Sure, yeah. I liked the idea of talking to children and hearing what children valued and what they needed and what made them feel safe, and then broadening that out to sort of everyone, and creating space for people to actually share what they need in a city and have those conversations, rather than someone in an office somewhere making decisions without input from the people who are experiencing the city every day, and how great that would be. So I didn't really have a question so much as just kind of going off of that thought. Thank you.
Yeah, and you know, that raises for me thinking about the importance of kind of community engagement and community participation, but of course really digging deep into that, because often it's kind of a surface level of community participation, like who's willing to show up to this meeting at 8 p.m. on a weeknight or whatever, to this building that's not accessible, wheelchair accessible, or, you know, like all of these, there's a lot of limits that are often on that participation. But if we could really do that right, you know, and involve the groups that have traditionally been the most left out, you know, it's more time consuming. It does take a bit longer, but another planner or developer that I was speaking to, she said, you know, it's worth it, because if you build something that the community doesn't use or finds unsafe or kind of becomes abandoned or whatever, it costs you a lot more to rebuild it or to redo it than it would to kind of get it right, or as close to right as you could in the first place. So kind of putting in the time and effort ahead of breaking ground, ahead of the design, could, you know, be the most, really in the long term, the most efficient way of doing it.
And Jessica, you also put in something about space. Did you want to ask her or comment?
Oh, yeah, sure. So I'd also mentioned, because you were talking about sort of the way that the pandemic has impacted us and also shown us, I think, things that maybe it was easier to overlook before. And one of the things that I have noticed is sort of, obviously with the pandemic and wanting to like keep that 6 feet of distance from other people, there's been a lot more value placed on that space between people. And how wonderful it would be if we could maintain that value into the future, because people have different experiences of like how they can be near people. I mean, people with different body shapes and sizes, people who use different accessibility tools, like having that extra space, you know, when you enter a building or between tables, could just make people's lives simply, in a very simple way, a lot better. And so I thought that was an interesting connection to the pandemic.
Yeah, in the book, I have a chapter that I call City of One, and it's kind of like about the right to be left alone. And I'm writing about it from a particularly gendered point of view, where our personal space is often not respected, and we are touched or spoken to without our consent all the time. Other groups of people as well. And so, yeah, it would be interesting to see if the pandemic kind of shifts that a little bit, where there is, and maybe empowers people as well to not accept it when somebody is getting too close to you or touches you in some way that you didn't want, like to, you know, now we're all used to being like, back up, keep your distance. So maybe it will empower us as well.
Thanks.
Pamela Steger made a great comment about asking about women-friendly places in the city. Pam, do you want to unmute and talk about your question?
Sure, but I just quickly like to respond to Jessica's point, and it's just because the image that came to mind for me when she talked about the 6 feet of separation and the, you know, shields and all that, was a picture that a friend of mine with a preschooler sent, and how sad it was to see these kids at individual tables with, you know, with masks on, and, you know, knowing how social they are at that point in time. And that I'm wondering, you know, what what education at that level might be lost, because it's also in that early education, I think, where we learn about privacy and safe touch and things like that. And if we're not anywhere near touching each other, those lessons might not be imparted. Anyway, that was just a comment. But what I wrote was that I feel so fortunate that for 25 years I've lived just blocks away from a strip of woods and river here in Providence. And I try and get out into it every day, and I call it my Mother Nature time. So it's very definitely a feminine, powerful place for me. And I've been doing some nature art in that space lately. But it made me wonder, through a feminist city lens. Like, I think of that as a safe space, even though I know woods isn't aren't always considered safe for women, and there have been some horrific, kind of things. I think there's a lot more in the media than there is in real life with women victims specifically. I don't know if that's meant to keep us out of the woods or what, but it just made me wonder whether in your research you or others that you know of have identified some more female friendly or everyone friendly, and safe places in a city.
It's a good question. I mean, many cities have used processes like safety audits, for example, which involve communities like coming together and doing, like, literally walking through spaces and, understanding not just how much light there is coming from the streetlights, but like, how do people feel, right? What can you see around you? Who else is on the street? Where could you, what mobility do you have? What are the access points? So I think in those cases, those are important design tools that can lead not only to like better design, but also to communities feeling like they do have a sense of, ownership and control over space, or just a sense of like, oh, we've engaged with this space. We had a part to play in shaping it or reshaping it. But it's a good question. I mean, I don't know offhand exactly what this sort of like, explicitly female friendly space is, except that it has, elements that recognize the kind of circumstances of women's lives, for example, that they are more likely to be caregivers, right? So how have you incorporated that into space? They are more likely to express fear in urban environments than men are, even though women are more likely to be assaulted at home than in public spaces. But, fear is fear. It matters, right? We have to address it. So, what have you done to improve that?
I think one of the things that I was thinking of too was, I would think that if people were asked, like, assign a gender to this building, like an elementary school would have traditionally been considered more feminine until Sandy Hook. And I think it was not just the horror of that event, but that it was that considered safe place, just like the women's room. And the book of the same name starts with, I think, a rape in a women's room. And it's just this doubly, triply, quadruply, violent assault to go into what is considered a safe space for women and be violent.
Yeah, very true. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you, Pamela. Next up, Julie said she would like to remain mute because her toddler is getting ready for bed. She said she absolutely loved your book, Leslie, and she was curious about your thoughts regarding how you are also thinking about access to physical space in the virtual realm. For example, during the pandemic, museums have opened up galleries to view, etc. And she said this strikes her as meaningful for people like her and others who are more homebound. Where does virtual space intersect with the experience of the city?
Oh, yeah, great question. Well, one of the things that I'm thinking about is the kind of, this may be sort of a bit tangential to your question, so I apologize, but thinking about the kind of double-edged sword of the like flexibility of the kind of work from home or even like travel from home, like go to your museums or do your virtual tours, and how that might in the long term kind of work against women in certain ways. So for example, you know, it seems like on the face of it that the flexibility to work from home is something that women have asked for a long time in order to help with the like juggling of care work and paid work, which most women have both. And, you know, cutting down on the time of commuting and having the flexibility, like if a child is sick, to be home, but also work, blah, blah, blah. But I think we've seen in the pandemic that
Do you want to
like
grab the food?
long term, that doesn't necessarily work that well, right? That actually trying to do a full-time job at home with young children, like, and with another partner, maybe who's there working, or teenagers, like pets, everything, it's kind of chaotic. And I also wonder, you know, going long-term, if we think about, okay, if there is this option to work from home long-term, who is more likely to take it and for what reason? So does this mean that the workforce is going to end up being a bit bifurcated, where more women are working at home, at least professional women, and more men are going back to the workplace? What implications might that have for women when it comes to promotions, where women are already overlooked and now you're like literally not physically there, right? Or training opportunities, or you know, all of the things that women struggle to have on equal ground now. If we're like not physically present in the workplace, I wonder if that's going to be a bit of a double-edged sword. So again, I know that's a bit of a tangent to your question, but it's just one of the things that I've been thinking of as this kind of, you know, what is the upside of this like increased accessibility to the virtual world, and what might some of the downsides be?
I think our next comment is from Rachel Kantrowitz. Do you want to unmute?
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks. I really enjoyed your talk. It resonates a lot with stuff I've thought about, experienced personally, and think about professionally. So I appreciate it. I had a question about like, what was the most surprising thing to you in writing your book? And maybe unrelated, but maybe related question about, was there anything over the course of writing your book or sense that you felt like could be maybe like an easy win for re-envisioning or redesigning a feminist city? Something where you're like, well, this seems simple. Like, why haven't we done this already? Because that would be really interesting to hear about. I imagine there are many challenges, but I thought I'd try to ask a more like glass half full sort of question.
Yeah, definitely. Good question. What was surprising to me? Well, maybe one thing that, you know, when I have a chapter called City of Friends, where I talk about friendship in the city. And when I sort of started writing that, it was maybe a bit more about just the city as a place for like the development of sort of female relationships. But the more I sort of got into it, the more that expanded to be kind of an entry point for thinking about how we might like blow up the traditional nuclear family, right? That we could, how can we imagine other sorts of kinship relationships that we could structure care work around, that we could structure the home around, that we could even structure work around, that go beyond this, you know, again, narrow traditional form that really is also not the way that the majority of people live their lives, certainly not their whole lives anymore. So friendship turned out to be this sort of interesting entry point to thinking about that. As for your second question, yeah, I do get asked this kind of question often, and I think there is some low-hanging fruit. I mean, tonight we've talked a little bit about restrooms, right? Like this should be an easy win, like more restrooms, accessible, you know, all gender, clean, safe restrooms. Like, let's make this happen. And then people can socialize outside even during a pandemic, right? The other one would be something kind of symbolic, like, you know, we saw this with Black Lives Matter over the past summer, like the toppling of statues, like Confederate statues, colonizers, all this crap. Like, let's do that. Like, let's take that crap down. Let's rename things. Let's tell different stories. Let's put up different monuments. This is not, I know it's controversial, but it's also like, it doesn't cost billions of dollars. It doesn't involve bulldozing huge sections of the city. It's like, let's name some things for women, for people of color. Let's get rid of these like genocidal maniacs that we have glorified in our urban spaces.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. I apologize for my yelling out. It's almost dinner time. And let's see who. Oh, Amelia is going to ask the next question. She has a question for you, Leslie.
Yeah, I put my name in the in the chat privately. I had a question when I was reading it about sort of the idea of another kind of COVID related question about sharing the workload of a household, individual household. And one of the things, I have 2 children at home, and one of the things that I've noticed during COVID is, you know, I've been thinking about restaurants, how to support restaurants, and the way that some restaurants have been able to like pull together donations to then like prepare meals for emergency workers or for hospital workers or different things like that. And like, where is there some kind of, and then I think about like some of the work that we've been tangentially involved in Providence with like the summer meal program for during, you know, during the summertime for kids out of school time, and how that has happened during COVID as well, like preparing meals for kids, and how those meals aren't always the most sought after meals for kids. You know, they don't necessarily like them all the time, but it is an important thing in terms of just basic nutrition and hunger relief. And I'm wondering about like, is there a way to like get restaurants that might have like access to fresher food, tastier food, healthier food, and like you know, giving them money to prepare, or donations, or through state funding to like prepare meals that are like more collectivized for community, that more people can access, and how that would really relieve a huge burden for moms and dads who always, you know, we have to prepare a meal every night, or we have to get food on the table in some way. I just thought it was an idea that I was thinking about and wanted to see if you had any thoughts or reactions.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting one, and I know very little about like the restaurant business, except that it's a very difficult business to be in the best of times, right? It's a very difficult business. So what if there was a sort of program where, in addition to restaurants doing what they normally do, they also had an income from the city or from the government that allowed them to use that space at different times, and they're not normally open or whatever, to produce these meals, which could be, you know, a sort like a kind of a stable source of income for restaurants that would, you know, kind of help with that bottom line, that narrow profit margin that they have, but would, you know, also play this community role, which I think we have seen so many restaurants kind of really step up and, you know, try to make use of their skills and their facilities and so on at times when they couldn't use them in the normal ways. So yeah, I mean, I think with enough like creativity and the right sorts of connections between the right kinds of people and funders, it's probably something that could happen.
Oh, I'm next. I'm supposed to, so thank you for answering my question. And the next person, I think, was Denise Brophy, who had a comment about the transit system. If you wanted to. I'll just read it. She just said a better transit system would better the network between people and open spaces, fewer cars, less of a carbon footprint, more economically stable. How can this happen? We've talked about healthier cities. What is the call to action now?
Yeah, that's so true, because right now you think of many cities, the transit systems kind of, the lines kind of come in, and then if you want to get to those like in between spaces, in between those like the subway lines or the main transit lines, like it's really difficult to do. And maybe that's where like your elderly parents live, or the school is, or the green space is. And so people often feel like they have to have a car because there's the transit options are not reliable, or they don't run at the times when they need them to run. They're very limited. So yeah, if we expanded those networks to include like residential areas and to extend further out of the city and to not be so limited in the times at which they run, then I think you do make it possible for people to give up their cars, right? Because you've given them like a viable alternative, a reliable way to get to work, good way to get to school, functional connectivity between different parts of the city, rather than just everything goes to the center. And then, you know, you got to come from over here, you got to go into the center, and then you got to go all the way out again to get to another part, right? Super time consuming for people. So, I mean, the call to action, again, as I said before, if we can kind of bundle like an environmental message with a justice message, with a, like, this is actually economically good message, then maybe we can make some headway.
Let me just follow up on that. As far as the call to action, which organizations would we, as consumers and people who live in and about the city, who would we contact? It wouldn't be just Public Works. I mean, there has to be a network.
Yeah, I mean, it probably varies a lot from place to place. I would imagine that, you know, this is also political, right? You have to get your representatives, like your city councilors, and maybe even up at the, depending on how your transit systems are funded, whether funding comes from the state level, down to the municipalities, like you have to get your elected representatives on board, because they're the ones who, you know, decide the budgets, right, for these kinds of projects. Yeah.
What would you advise as far as a grassroots movement? What would you like to see?
In Providence, I would recommend talking to the Providence Streets Coalition. Liza Birkin is the person to reach out to, and we can, if you could email me, I'll put my email in the chat, and you can email me, and I'm happy to connect you with. And there's the RIPTA Riders Union, and there's you know, a bunch of different transit advocacy organizations for sure.
All right, thanks, Amelia. Thank you.
Thanks, Denise. And I'll connect you. So Denise is also another library manager in Providence. Denise, I can connect you with Amelia, and I'm also part of the Providence Great Streets because they're doing a lot on Broad Street coming up. So I will share that email with you as well.
Thank you.
So I'm just going to, because we're running a little over time, I'm going to ask the last two questions that popped up in the chat that were from people that had already unvideoed before. Let's see, Judith had asked, who designs the restrooms?
Yeah, I did ask that, right? I mean, who design? We have a group here in Chicago called Chicago Women in Architecture, but I could tell you that our big architecture center rarely has women speaking, even though it is headed up by a woman. But, you know, if we take a look at the number of women architects versus male architects, it's definitely more male. But in the medical community, a lot more women are becoming physicians.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so we are seeing changes.
Yeah, architecture is still very male dominated, as is kind of like design, like industrial design, like the kind of work that would go into designing those physical spaces. So that is another part of the picture of like the feminist city, is kind of who builds the city, who is in these professions. And, you know, I don't think anybody goes to architecture school to be like, I'm going to design a great public restroom. Like, nobody is that excited about it. But on the other hand, these things like make a real difference in people's lives. So maybe we do need to get architects excited about the next great public restroom project.
I mean, I've heard stories at some of our sporting events where women had to use the men's washrooms. So I don't know. I'm never going to go out of the house again. That I can assure you.
Yeah, that seems fair.
Thanks, Judith. And Pamela said I could just ask her question instead of unmuting her. She asked, are there cities that integrate a gender perspective in their development plans?
Yeah, so some cities, I think it's a bit more common in European cities to have what's called like a gender mainstreaming approach, where all of your urban decisions, everything from, you know, where that new bus line is going to the new school, to the park, to housing developments, are run through kind of a gender equity lens. So you have to ask, is this decision going to increase gender equity or not? So gender mainstreaming, like Vienna is kind of famous for doing this. Barcelona, Stockholm have gender mainstreaming plans and gender-based like urban planning documents. Those aren't the only ones. They're just some of the ones that I'm a little bit more familiar with. But yes, like it exists, and we could do it here in North America too. Imagine.
Thank you everyone so much. Thank you, Leslie, for coming to speak with us. This was wonderful. Thank you, Amelia, for being our co-host for PCL Reads. This was our new adventure. It was our first co-host outside the library world. And I wanted to just let everyone know who's interested. Next month, we will be virtually traveling to Rochambeau Library, so the east side of town, and it will be a book discussion. We'll be talking about The Story of Arthur Truelove by Elizabeth Berg. So if anyone would like to attend that, it's on Monday, May 10th, and it's at 6 o'clock. It's our usual third Monday of the month. So hope to see you all at Rochambeau. And thank you, everyone. This was wonderful. And thanks, Lee, for coordinating.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Great
you.
to meet everyone. Thank you.
Thanks. Good night, everybody.